welcome to another episode of Pause for Payments. I'm Kristy Duncan, and I am delighted to be here with an amazing thought leader, strategist, and expert today, Liz Oakes. Liz is EVP of Strategy and Operations Excellence, love that title, at Mastercard, and she's based in London. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Kristy. Delighted to join you today.
Thanks for being here. Today, we're going to talk about the future of money, especially in the context of our new normal, where it seems that everything and everyone is migrating to digital, online, and even contactless where and when we can. Liz has some amazing global expertise and has forgotten more about payments than I'm sure I ever knew. So it's really exciting, and she's going to be a perfect person for this discussion. Liz, the current pandemic has had a tremendous impact on how people make payments. Can you outline for us the highlights for the UK and perhaps other markets and changes that we've seen?
Delighted to. So I think the interesting thing we've all witnessed has been the rapid adoption or increased adoption of contactless. I don't think I've seen anything take off, or it's the most massive nudge that we've probably all witnessed in a short period of time for quite a lot, many years. And so contactless really for us in the UK was something that was pretty well embedded. You know, certain parts of the UK, I would say London, Bristol, some of the more urban areas had embraced contactless quite significantly in the last few years. But what we have seen is just a massive uptake in contactless. And it was really interesting to witness, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of people had just never tried it, or, you know, they had the card, it had the symbol, but they still stuck it into the machine, or they just never got around to it. And suddenly we had this focus on personal safety and hygiene. And even though the WHO never actually said that there was anything wrong with using cash, I think just everyone's, you know, we had this, you know, fairly dramatic kind of fear and awe kind of TV journalism going on. So everybody was in the, oh my God, I have to wear gloves, or I have to wash my hands 15 times a day. Cash didn't seem to be a fantastic idea. I'm not sure that there was an awful lot of logic to some of this, but what's happened is actually just that everybody has tried to figure out ways that at least the perception is much cleaner and it's much more efficient. It also is much faster in queues if you're actually in a store or trying to do something in person. So that's been really interesting to watch, because it's just taken off tangentially. And I think not just in the UK, we've actually seen that globally. At Mastercard, we conducted a survey of users, people actually paying for things around the world. We do this every few years. And this year, our State of Pay report actually looked at, you know, what's going on in not just the UK and the US, but many of the other markets that we were active participants in. And I think the interesting thing is, like, 79% of participants, of respondents across 19 countries said that they're now using contactless. So something that we thought was probably going to take years to take off has taken off at such a dramatic pace in a whole raft of countries that we would not have necessarily predicted. And that has definitely been the nudge of this crisis, or this pandemic. And I think when you look at some of the places that you actually wonder, like, okay, so where are the places that this really stands out? It's actually places like Thailand and the Philippines,
Wow.
India and China. And so sometimes, you know, we think the Western world, we've invented all these fantastic digital things, but actually consumer adoption is usually it's often far greater in some of these other economies. So what we were seeing is actually India has the highest adoption of contactless payments at 81%. 81%. That's, you know, it's phenomenal. And I think then when you move on from contactless, because people are increasingly using their phones more than anything else. I don't know about you, Kristy, but I found myself in the midst of all of this quite often, because I was at home all the time. I, as a woman, I gave up using my handbag. I just literally had my phone, my keys, and my mask, and that was it.
And the mask.
The mask. You go everywhere with a mask. But you know, I think we were predicting years ago that you know, you would be able to just go outside with just your phone, and your phone would open your front door. I haven't quite got to that point yet, but I definitely I'm in the. I have my phone and I have my keys, and I have a mask everywhere I go. And I think that that shift towards using your phone has been far more marked. So when we did this survey, also what really stood out for me was that in countries like China, India, and Thailand, more than 90% of people are using their phone. And I think that, that's a selection of different apps depending on which country you're in. But we can see in China, 98% of people are now using their phone to pay for pretty much everything.
Fantastic.
No, which
Wow.
I don't think, even 3 years ago, if somebody had predicted that, no one would have believed the 98%
Yeah,
anyway.
it's a fantastic number. And I keep hearing stories of travelers to China who can't
Can't pay for
pay for
anything.
things because cash doesn't work. Nobody wants it, and they don't have the app, and they don't have a local bank account to debit from, and
So
cards don't really work either.
we're working on that. We are trying to improve interoperability with in some of these countries, precisely to that point. It's not just China. A number of countries have gone down their own route in terms of things like QR payments, NFC transaction types that the rest of us are not particularly don't have access to. So I think that's the case in Mexico. I have been on stage and joked with some of these central bankers who come up with these wonderful banking groups that come up with these wonderful solutions, which are fantastic in their own country. But as a foreigner who doesn't speak the language and has no idea how to buy a Coke, that's kind of not good for tourism necessarily. So we're working, I think, though, across the industry on the issues like that, like interoperability. It's probably, though, not dissimilar, to be perfectly blunt, if you were there with cash, because if you can't read the number on the banknotes either, and that has happened to me, I'm sure it's happened to you, Kristy, you're none the wiser, and you can easily get scammed by someone who just takes the largest banknote that you've got in your hand. So I don't see that there's necessarily a big deal with that. I think it's just figuring out how you get around those, and that is increasingly getting better. So I think we went down to some of the practical elements around, okay, so what do we need to do to make this work? So around the globe, Mastercard worked to have the increase of the contactless limit raised, so that it was much more practical. Because let's face it, if you were going to the grocery store to buy milk and bread and eggs and things like that, that was fairly straightforward. Now, in a situation where you're going to the grocery store and you're actually trying to do your entire shop and do everything, contactless, or buy other things, that became a bit more of an issue. So we're taking very practical, pragmatic steps to try to make these things more accessible.
Yeah, and we in Canada have our credit card limits raised to $250, which for me
Wow.
is fantastic because then I can always tap, right?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Although it's interesting, some people think that that's fabulous, and then other people are worried that if they lose their card in the street, by the time they've figured that out and got home, someone's gone and tapped several times with $250. So we have to kind of balance this with the needs of people in terms of security and safety. Convenience is one side of a coin, safety and security quite often are the other. So it is a little bit of a challenge. And I think the other things that we've seen are just the practical realities of what we've been going through. Quite often people now need slightly more complex arrangements. So, if you've had elderly neighbors or you've had someone in your family where you need to go do their shopping for them, the practicalities of trying to do delegated payments or split payments, particularly when people don't want to use cash or it's not convenient, or, if someone is ill, you quite possibly don't necessarily want to take either a card or cash from them physically, so you kind of want a different answer. Some of those challenges I think have really spurred the industry to come up with some amazing answers. So we've seen issuers issuing cards for, delegated cards so that a neighbor can do shopping for them with a limit that they can, manipulate on an app or something like this. So those things I think have been really interesting to see, because those are the kinds of problems that we've had for years and we've just never figured out how to deal with them.
Yeah, no, yeah, the time is right, and we've got this tremendous nudge, as you keep calling it. I'm calling it more of a push, but yeah, those innovation curves are absolutely compressing, and great to see some positive, the silver lining to this COVID cloud, as I call it, really push the innovation in the market. Um, I want to talk a little bit about cash because we've got this kind of love-hate relationship with cash, and some people love it, and in some cultures in Latin America, for example, in Asia, it's more prevalent than in others. But during the pandemic, we've perhaps withdrawn a little bit with cash because there's fears that it can transmit the virus. And how do you see the role of cash changing post-pandemic?
So I think there is this perception that we, along with several other organizations, have some kind of war going on cash, which is definitely and absolutely not true. I think if anything, we have a war for choice, which is, actually enabling financial inclusion means getting people access to digital products and services and allowing them to participate in the economy. But there are instances where people will want to continue to use cash, and it's actually quite difficult sometimes to do digital transactions that are anonymous, for example. So it does depend what you're trying to buy or what you're trying to do. And I think quite often, all of us will remember as children having been given cash and trying, the education piece of, well, I gave you the money. If you've spent the money's all gone. It's very physical in front of a child. They can see precisely what they've got left. I still think that's going to be one of those hurdles that we're going to be challenged to try to address, because when small children are at that age, they're probably not necessarily going to believe that something digital or on a screen in front of them is particularly real. It's like another game. So that's an interesting question. But I do think we've come a long way in tackling some of those challenges. So we have lots of cards now and apps for children that you can actually do a lot of that education with. And there are also then just, we quite often design for what I would call the 1% or the 2%, but the rest of the world doesn't always necessarily have access to mobile telephone or to have internet banking, etc. Cash is a very physical kind of almost a comfort blanket for people. You hear about people having money under the mattress or under their bed. Absolutely. I think, all of us intrinsically would kind of go, what happens if the electricity goes down? What happens if broadband doesn't work or my phone's not working, or, so it's one of those things that I think is going to take a very, very long time before we contemplate, getting rid of cash. I'm not suggesting that that's ever necessarily going to be an outcome. I think the question is more, how do we help people for whom cash is the only access mechanism that they have to be able to participate in the economy? That's probably more of a focus for us. But we've definitely seen interesting I guess push and pull. So as you saw, lots of younger people returning back to their parents' homes in the COVID environment, and I think that is pretty evenly happened across all countries. We saw, particularly in urban areas, younger people where they were furloughed or they didn't have work, returning back to family homes and seeking shelter and community with their families. And so what we have seen is quite often then parents or grandparents effectively subsidizing young people, and I would say, between 16 and 25, with cash handouts. And you can picture this yourself in your own family. Grandma gives grandchild, like, quietly gives them $20 and says, here, you can use that to buy gas, or, to be able to the extent you can go out with your friends, to have some fun. And so that actually tends to be cash. And it's hard to know whether that's just because people don't want to trace it, or actually they just don't have a routine of paying that person electronically. So there's no long-term commitment with it if you just hand somebody the cash. So that's an interesting outcome that I think presents then with some interesting challenges, because in many cases, like we've seen in the UK, I think 1 in 10 people reported that they actually couldn't use cash to buy something in the midst of COVID.
Oh boy, wow.
Because
interesting.
retailers just don't want to take it.
There was a fear, especially early on in the pandemic, and some of the central banks actually have been apparently sanitizing the banknotes as they get circulated through the economy. So I'm hoping that that has quietened down a little bit, but there generally is that reduction in the use of cash. Although, oddly enough, in Canada, the issuance of $100 bills has increased since the pandemic. Perhaps going back to your comment earlier about cash under the mattress, or using cash as that lowest common denominator fallback in case the digital
Yeah.
fails for whatever reason.
I think so I was
Go
going
ahead.
to say with reserve currencies, there's always been that issue that people store high value notes for a variety of reasons. I don't even think anybody's ever established where all this money has gone, but I know that there are tens of billions of UK pounds that vanished. And at one point, I think a lot of people had speculated that actually they're offshore. It is being held as a reserve cash currency. When you change the notes or you change the coins, suddenly you get a recurrence of the currency comes back into circulation miraculously. But absolutely, people have the right to do that, and I think we have to respect people's right to choice. If they want to use cash and it's convenient and it's safe and it's secure for them, then that's great. But conversely, lots of people don't want to keep cash in their home, so
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
balance.
And then there's the story of what they did in India with demonetization. So all of a sudden your cash overnight becomes quite worthless. So that's another whole story. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about opportunities. We've talked about the innovation that's going on. Do you see other opportunities for payments as we move forward into this new normal?
I think it's probably an acceleration of a lot of things that were already going on. So for us, probably the focus is increasingly much more on convenience and experience. So it's payments is rapidly kind of, I would say, almost fading into the background. So it's usually it's the result of something I'm trying to do. So if I'm trying to book a holiday, we all hope to be able to go on holiday as soon as possible, ideally. But when you want to do something, in normal circumstances, if you want to book a holiday, you want to go to a restaurant, you want to go to an event, you want to do something, actually, you're far more interested in what that experience is, and perhaps use loyalty points or book it with a friend or do something. So actually, the payment is probably not the most exciting thing you're trying to do, and you kind of want it to go away, to become simple. Most people sadly are very repetitive. So we do the same kinds of things all the time. We order the same takeaways, we go to the same movie theaters, we go to the same stores. So quite often it's embedding convenience into that says, they recognize me, they know who I am, they value my business. I get extra points, or I get a discount, or I get some additional services. So trying to combine all of those aspects into payments and trying to actually add value, I think, is the challenge that most of us are tackling at the moment. How to enable people to transact with small businesses, in some cases where they might never have been digital before. Discovering your neighborhood bakery or something that you've just never used before, because maybe you were on the train and you were going to work, means that actually for a lot of those businesses, they have to really up their game and change how they transact with people. So I think for us, a lot of the innovation is now much more thoughtful, much more relevant to local communities. And also we are striving, we have a target to bring 1 billion people into the financial ecosystem. So targeting actually getting people who've never been able to set up a business, to transact properly on their own, to actually get those people involved. So I think that really is powering a lot of the innovation that we're seeing, because it's all about now enabling people to do business in the current climate, to get paid and to be able to participate.
Well, those are great thoughts, Liz. And you're right, there are so many opportunities, and bringing, all of the various stakeholders, the merchants, the small businesses, but also the perhaps digitally, financially excluded or underserved people into the foray is really awesome. And you're right, there's a lot, there are billions of financially under or unserved people in the world that you know, need to be able to benefit from those financial services that aren't available to them if they're not um, serviced. I want to talk a little bit about business and government payments. We've talked about consumers a lot, a little bit about the small businesses, but can you share your insights as to how they may have changed and how the pandemic might be shaping them for the future?
So I think the first thing all of us saw was a mad scramble to try to get relief and funds out to people who really needed support and who continue to need support. So it's not a one-off. I don't think any government in any country was particularly well placed to identify who should receive funds, how we would get the money to them, what that means, you know, all the checks and balances that need to happen, but to do it at pace and at speed. And that's something that we've really leaned into in a variety of ways, actually. In some countries, like the UK, where we operate the infrastructure, we've been supporting electronic disbursement, particularly out from the Department for Work and Pensions, but also actually from, you know, banks have also been lending money, government funds and other funds out into small businesses and even to larger businesses. So getting an efficient, reliable operational infrastructure in place really fast to make that happen is very important to us. I think in North America, in common with many countries, getting that kind of loan portfolio up and running and getting the money back out to small community organizations as well as via large banks has been quite a big lift. In a country that's used to checks, it's quite difficult sometimes to get people to embrace the fact they're not being scammed. This is us trying to give you money digitally. Please, you know, engage with the process, otherwise you're not going to get any money. That's tough because a lot of people were used to check cashing services or you know, other means of getting paid. I think then in other places it's been about loading prepaid cards or you know, being able to get disbursements out to everybody, because we're talking about also the homeless. We had a huge movement in the UK to get the homeless off the streets, and they were put into hotels for the duration of the lockdown. So trying to get financial services to people who don't actually have an identity that would be recognized or KYC'd by a bank is a huge challenge. And I think that this is, you know, just probably our societies getting used to that displacement that we see in many countries where, you know, you will have seen in the US from Latin America, you had a huge number of people coming into the country. We've had that across Europe. We have lots of refugees and asylum seekers fleeing persecution or economic challenge in the countries that they've come from. So we have to tackle these questions, but actually something like COVID sometimes brings that very back to home, really, to the problem on your doorstep. And so we are tackling that, I think, in a much more meaningful way. But governments, I think, are also just trying to navigate how to go digital. So in many cases, you know, they're still in the midst of their own digital programs, and they're trying to figure out not just the payments bit of it, but actually all of the rest of it. Yeah. And so to the extent that we can help government and tackle some of those things where we have some insight or expertise, and I think this applies not just to Mastercard, but across the industry. How do we help government to actually do these things in a way that's meaningful, that has longevity, that's going to be robust, and actually people will, you know, accept that this is a good way to transact? Because in many cases, if it's a one-off, it's one thing, but if this goes on for quite some time, we have to put those mechanisms in place.
Indeed. Yeah, all good points, Liz. Which brings me to my next question. I think you're the perfect person to ask this because not a lot of people can actually see the global payments ecosystem in a way that you can. You've got such great experience and insights around the world and understanding how all of the pieces and all the players fit together. And we've seen such incredible change over the last 5 years, but even the last 5 months. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the payment system and what structural changes you think we might expect to see in the coming years?
So it's very difficult to forecast, I think. The structure is shifting, undoubtedly. We have where I think we were all very clear about the role of central banks in the past and in the present. In the future, that might also change with the advent of central bank digital currency, for example. I think when you then cascade out to payment operators, there are more operators all the time. I think there are then, in an era where you would say there were issuers, merchants, acquirers, and corporates and retailers. Actually, now we have a huge number of participants in the market. We have marketplaces, we have ecosystem plays where actually there are a number of connected parties that are all part of a value chain before you even get near what would have historically been necessarily the processor. So I think as we embark on things like open banking, for example, for us is really the dislocation of manufacturing, if you said that that was kind of debit and credit operations within a bank, and the actual distribution of, using payments or actually getting access to services. So we see that increasingly there will still be those providers of balance sheet financing and actually the underlying operations of lending and deposit taking. But the distribution in terms of who am I as a consumer actually interacting with, it's probably an app, it's probably some cool provider, or it could even be a marketplace provision where you have, okay, I've got this app that I want to save my money with, and then I've got, that's connected maybe to a bank account, but that might not be my primary bank account. Or I could have a payment account, I could have a wallet, I could have all sorts of systems that I interact with. And probably those will be best of breed. So you'll want to use the best app that you can find for your circumstances or your, it could be demographic, it could be your age, it could be, your club or society that you want to interact with. So I think the whole sort of ecosystem or the whole environment is exploding with a range of options. Sometimes I think there are too many because it's a little bit complicated to try and discern what's actually the best idea. But there's nothing wrong with having lots of choice, so long as you can figure out what the best options are. I guess the challenge that we're all going to have to navigate is how do these things string together in a meaningful way that provides me with the service provision that I want? And at the same time, it needs to be safe and secure. So what we have also witnessed with COVID, sadly, has been an explosion in the number of scams. And so I think for me personally, a move towards digital identity, a move towards more secure, robust ecosystems and networks where I can identify reasonably well or fairly easily who am I dealing with. And if I can't identify who am I dealing with, I can figure out a way to ask somebody else, who am I dealing with, and try and link together a liability framework for myself, or try to figure out why would I rely on that party if I don't actually know who they are. So I think those things have become much more clear and present as problems for us as individuals as well as an industry. And so these ecosystems, and as they explode and they change and they grow and they will alter over time. What we do have to do now is navigate, and probably with significant aid or help from regulators and supervisors to try to figure out how do you know that something is safe. So for us at the moment, we're working on open banking in that context and trying to figure out and help other people figure out who is that entity? Are they regulated? Do they have a license? Is that message that's come from a customer really from the actual customer that's my customer that's trying to do that? Or is it a scam? And I think that's something that's going to take quite significant effort, particularly cross-border. It's one thing being able to identify something in your own language, in your own country, with your own supervisor, and you go onto the system and you can figure it out. Once you start crossing those boundaries, I think it's really hard because you don't actually know enough to know whether or not that's true.
Yeah, all such interesting challenges, but they need to be addressed as we want to move into this digital age, because the security, the trust is what banks have traditionally built their reputations on. And moving to a digital world, you need to reestablish how do you establish and maintain and guarantee that trusted relationship? And who are you? Are you who you say you are? All of these are really good questions, not only between the bank and the customer, but between all of these different players as the ecosystem broadens. Fantastic insights, Liz. I love them. They're really informative and so forward looking. It's looks like it's going to be a really exciting next few years. What are you looking forward to most? As the last question today, what are you looking forward to most in the next few years in the payments market?
I think figuring out how do we collaborate, how do we cooperate in a world where we're not meeting in rooms to talk about stuff is actually quite challenging. You know, Kristy, you'll know yourself, you know, when we convene together in physically in a room or in a conference, the buzz, the vibe, the energy is infectious. And I think also the exchange of ideas, even in corridors and you know, people coincidentally meeting because they know somebody in common. So being able to promote those conversations, to innovate, to be able to collaborate with people that you don't necessarily know, right now I find a little bit challenging. I think it's okay if you're working on something that was already pre-existing with people that maybe you at least knew 90% of them before COVID. But I will admit it's difficult with new employees. It's difficult to build the culture, build the trust, build that kind of shared passion to get something done. So that's kind of the probably supersedes all of the, you know, whether it's payments or whether it was cooking, or it could be something completely different. It's that piece I think is hard. I think also creating an optimistic future path right now. You know, for our kids, for the young people in our businesses, you know, right now everything seems to be kind of doom and gloom, and nobody can see a way out of this. And I think it's really incumbent on a number of us to kind of go, the world will continue. People still need to, you know, eat, drink, continue to have a life. We have to improve things. So what can we do to make this better, rather than just sitting around worrying about it? So I think having that kind of momentum and really committing, you know, to continuing to actually achieve some of the objectives and goals we've set ourselves. So I think, you know, for me, what it is really a driving force in our business is one of, you know, the commitments that we're making to the market. And I think that for me, the commitment to bring 1 billion people into the financial ecosystem, it's an enormous target. It's a very ambitious target, but it's the right thing to do. And so actually being able to put some muscle behind that and you know, walk the talk, as my boss says, is really going to make a difference. So trying to find, you know, what will make a difference and what can you do in the circumstances we find ourselves in is, I think, the only way out of this.
Yeah, I love that, and it echoes the words of one of your colleagues I was speaking to in the U.S. just yesterday, actually, Jess Turner, who said, you know, we are in a fortunate position to have the foresight and the drive and the support from our shareholders and our senior executives to do the right thing, to do what is right for humanity. And I love that. I love the leadership that Mastercard shows, the leadership that we get from Ann Cairns, one of my personal heroes, to do the right thing. So thank you for taking that leadership on. It's so important. Liz, thanks so much for sharing your insights today. I always learn a ton when I talk with you, and today is no different, of course. It's been a really informative discussion, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Kristy. It's a pleasure.
Always. I'm going to encourage all of our audience to join us today and in the future to listen to all of our amazing Pause for Payments webinars when we get amazing women leaders and experts like Liz talking about payments and careers and all exciting things. So thanks everybody for listening.